Hey guys, Wes here. In this video series, we're going to be doing some mobile development using Ionic. So we're going to be building a simple note-taking application that we'll deploy to Ionic View so that we could actually test our application out on, say, an iPhone, for instance, or any other mobile device. So let's take a look. So here's a look at the application we'll be building in this series. You can see that we have an app called My Notes, and on the front page of this application we have a list of notes that we've created in the past, and you can see that we have the ability to create a new note either by clicking the button at the bottom of the screen here, or at the upper right hand corner we have this icon that we can click on to add a new note. So on this page we have the ability to supply a date and a title and some note content, and we can actually go ahead and save that note, and we'll look at using Ionic storage to actually persist the data that we save to our application. So once we've created some notes here, we can click on them and then we get taken to a sort of detail page, if you will, where we have a title and the date and the note content displayed, and it's here we can actually delete a note, which will take us back to the home page. We'll also look at how to do some basic styling, so for instance having different background images for the different pages that we have, as well as using some of Ionic's out-of-the-box components like these buttons and these list items and the icons, for instance. Towards the end of the series, we'll look at how to deploy this application to Ionic View so that we could actually test it on, say, an iPhone, even though I'll be developing on Windows throughout this series. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually install Ionic and Cordova, and we'll use npm for that. So if you don't have npm, make sure that you have Node installed first of all, which should actually install the npm package manager. So we'll go ahead and npm install -g Ionic, and I'm going to use specifically at the time of this recording the current version, which is 3.19.0, and we'll also install Cordova at 8.0.0. So the reason I'm going to install a specific version here is because, of course, in the future these versions will update and they may make breaking changes. So if you'd like to follow along with the video, then installing these specific versions should make that a little bit easier. Okay, so once those are installed, we can go ahead and create a new project using Ionic Start. So we're going to say Ionic Start My Notes, and this will just be the name of your application. So feel free to name this whatever you like. Here we're going to have the option to choose a starter template, and for this series I'm just going to use a blank template, which will just be a very simple starter project. And for now we'll say no to whether or not we'd like to integrate our new app with Cordova, and we'll also say no to whether or not we want to install Ionic Pro SDK. Okay, and with that, Ionic has created a new directory for us, so we can go ahead and cd into My Notes. And if we just take a look at what's in this directory, we can see that we have a new project scaffolded out for us. So this is going to look pretty similar to an Angular project that might be created with the Angular CLI, for instance. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code in this directory. And you can see that we have this source directory, which contains a number of different directories, as well as our index.html, and a directory called Pages, where we have this home directory that has a home.html page, an assets directory, and an app directory. So before we dive into some code, let's go ahead and just start the application and see what it looks like. So for that we can just use Ionic serve. And so you can see that this is going to start our development server running on port 8100 in my case, and so it should open up a new browser window here, and this is our Ionic application. So throughout this series I'm actually just going to be using Chrome to sort of debug our application, and we'll be using the inspector here, so if you Control-Shift-I to open that, and here I will have the device toolbar toggled, so just select this icon to toggle between sort of desktop mode and device mode. And with the device toolbar, note that you can also select a preset device. So this is kind of nice, so we can see how our application would look if we were using any number of different type of built-in devices here. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and take a look at our home page. So I'm in the pages directory, and then under home, we're looking at home.html here. And we'll just make this look a little bit neater. Okay, so right off the bat, we can see we have this Ion header tag that contains an Ion navbar and then Ion title, where we have this Ionic blank title here. Let's go ahead and change this to my notes. And when we save, we can see that our development server restarts, and we should see my notes in the header bar here. Likewise, we can change what's inside this Ion content tag, so we'll just remove that for now. So now we have a completely blank content area. So if you've developed other applications with Angular in the past, the directory structure here will look pretty familiar. So Ionic has this pages directory that will contain a directory for any number of different Angular components that we might build. So any Ionic application will consist of any number of different pages, and any one of those pages is an Angular component. So you'll notice that in the home directory, if we look at the TypeScript file here, we can see that we have our component directive where we have our selector and our template URL, and then the class homepage with some default constructor that's been scaffolded out here. One thing that we don't have here is an array containing our styles, which you may see if you've used the Angular CLI, for instance, or worked on another Angular project. Instead, by default, Angular is currently using SCSS files, and we don't need to include this in our style sheets array. Here in SCSS, we can actually just nest our selectors, and so any styles which go into our page home component here will apply to this specific component. You could, of course, use the sort of standard Angular style sheet array in your component decorator, but for this series, I'll just stick with using SCSS as well. Okay, so let's take a look at our app module TypeScript file in our app directory. So here you'll see our declarations where we'll put some of the new components that we create. Notice also that in this application we have an entry components array in our app module file, and we're also going to put any of the pages that we'd like to visit in our application here as well. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail a little bit later. So let's look now at our app.html file. So you can see that all this contains is an Ion nav element. And here we have a reference to this root page property, which if we take a look in our TypeScript file, simply stores a reference to our homepage component. And so our root page here, in this case our homepage, will be at the bottom of a stack of pages that we might navigate through when we use our application. So Ionic is going to use a stack to essentially manage routing in our app. So this is different than using like URL routes like you might use in a standard web application. In this case, Ionic is going to use something called the nav controller, which will basically manage that stack. So the page at the top of the stack will be the current page that we're viewing, and then to go to a previous page, we would simply pop the top page off of the stack, which would cause the page under the previous top page to be at the top. And likewise, if we'd like to visit somewhere else in our application, we can simply push a page onto the stack, causing a new page to be at the top. So Ionic essentially manages all of our navigation using this stack of pages. We always view the topmost page of a stack, and we navigate by either pushing or popping new pages onto that stack. So let's go ahead and generate our first new page. So I'm going to leave the server running and just open up a new console. And here we can just use Ionic generate page, and let's call this page add note. Okay, so we'll head back into the code, and notice that in our pages directory we have this new directory add note. So with that created, let's go ahead and check out the HTML file, and we're going to change add note here to simply add note, and we'll go ahead and remove some of this generated stuff from the template generator. And then in Ion content here, I'll simply say add note page. So what I'm going to do now is create a button on our home page that we can click, and then it will take us over to our add note page to sort of demonstrate that routing concept that we just talked about. So let's go into home, and then in home.html, what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a button here. So notice that when we use this Ion button directive, we get some nice default styling for our button. So here I'm just going to add a click listener, and we'll just create a method called add note. So now if we go into our home TypeScript file, we'll go ahead and create that method. And now we're going to use this nav controller that we have access to that's been injected into our constructor here to actually push the add note page onto the top of our navigation stack, if you will. So now we just need to make sure to add a reference to add note page. And then in our app module file, we need to also go ahead and add that to our list of declarations. And make sure it's imported here as well. And then we'll also need to include it in our entry components. So now if we click our button, you can see we get taken to our add note page. Now we're going to go ahead and create a new service that will be used for managing the notes in our application. So this service will be responsible for both creating new notes as well as retrieving them for us so that we can see them either in a list or a detailed view. And we can just use the Ionic CLI to generate that service for us. So we will say Ionic generate provider note service. And this is going to create a new directory called providers, and that will contain our new class note service in a subdirectory of the same name. So you can see that it's just an Angular service. We have our injectable decorator here. I'm just going to go ahead and remove some of this boilerplate. And here we're going to use Ionic storage, which will essentially allow us to save key value pairs as well as JSON data for our application. It uses a variety of different means of storing data, including SQLite and local storage. So I'm going to head back to the command line, and here we'll just say Ionic Cordova plugin add Cordova SQLite storage. Okay, so let's go ahead and minimize this. And now in our note service, what I'm going to do is go ahead and import storage from Ionic storage. Now we need to head into our app module, and then in our imports array here, just after the Ionic module for root, we're going to go ahead and also import Ionic storage module for root. Okay, and just make sure that this gets imported as well at the top of the file. So let's head back to our add note page. So under pages, add note.html, and let's create a basic form here. So within the Ion content tags, I'm going to go ahead and create a new form. And at first, we're going to use a simple template-driven form. So first of all, we'll say on submit here. What we'll do is we'll call some method add note in our component, and we'll store a local reference to the form here, which we'll set to ngForm, and this will give us a reference to the form that we're currently using, and then we can pass f.value to this method in our component. So this will be the simple example first. So we'll just write it out really quickly here. So first we'll create a new Ion item using this Ion item attribute. Likewise, we can use Ion label to create a label for our form, which we'll just call title. And then we can use Ion text area with the name of title. Okay, and now for this simple example here, at first we'll be using a template-driven approach. So we'll use ngModel here to get a reference to the title property here in our component that we can then use. And then just below the item here, we'll have our button, Ion button, and here we'll just say save note. So now we'll have access to this object that has a title from our form based on whatever we type into our text area. So let's go ahead and select add note, and you can see that we have our text field and then save note here. So what I'm going to do is head into our add note TypeScript file, and again we'll remove some of this boilerplate. And you can see that we have a sort of lifecycle hook method that gets called here, which currently is just logging something to the console when the Ionic view loads. So we're going to go ahead and just remove that as well. And we're going to create our add note method in our add note TypeScript file. And in fact, I think I'd like to call this save note. So let's go ahead and rename this to save note. And then back in our TypeScript file here, we have our save note function, and what we're going to do is pass it this value, which will be an object that has a title property on it, which is of type string. And so now we'd like to actually make use of our note service, so we'll go ahead and inject that into this constructor. So we'll call it note service, and it will be of type note service. And we can go ahead and make that import here as well. Okay, and so it looks like it can't resolve our note service, saying that it has no exported member note service. So let's go take a look here. Okay, so it's calling it note service provider. I think I'd like just to call it note service, so we'll change the name here. And then in our app module, we'll also need to make sure that the name that we import here is also note service. We'll head down into our providers and should just have one note service. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close some of these open tabs. And then in our add note TypeScript file, we now have a valid import of our note service, and we've injected it into our constructor here. So now let's go ahead and invoke it. So we'll call this .note service. And here we'll have a save note method that will pass value, which in this case is currently just the title of the note that we're going to create. So let's go ahead and create this method in our note service. So I'm just going to F12 on note service, and we'll remove what's in our constructor, and we'll go ahead and create this method save note. It's obviously going to take the value of our note title, so we'll make the input parameter note, which will be of a type object that has a title on it, which is a string. And then what we need to do is essentially push this note that we want to save onto an array of these notes. And for now, let's just do a really simple way of doing that, where we'll actually just store a reference to those notes in this service. So I'm going to go ahead and above the constructor create a private notes property, which will be basically an array of objects that contain a title of type string. And we can even initialize that just as an empty array here. And then you can see all we need to do now is to actually push onto that array of notes. So we have a way to save our notes, and now we also need a way to, of course, retrieve them. So let's create a method getAllNotes. And here all we need to do is actually return this .notes. And in fact, maybe here we'll just return a copy of this .notes, which we could do using the spread operator. This would also be like if we wanted to use slice instead of the spread operator. So in a sense, we're just returning a copy of this .notes and not returning sort of a pointer to it directly. But in any case, we can use a spread operator or slice for that. Okay, so then back in our add note component, we've now completed our method to save the note, which should call the save note function in our note service, adding it to that array of notes that it's collecting. And now maybe on our home page, so if we look in the home TypeScript file, we'll use the note service to get all the notes and then display them out here. So again, we'll inject a private note service here, type note service, and we'll go ahead and make that import. And so just after our add note method that we created, we can create one called getAllNotes. And here we'll return all notes from our note service. So we can call this .note service .getAllNotes. That will return again a copy of that array of notes that is stored in the note service. And then we'll have an analogous array of notes in this component. So we can have notes, which again will be an array of this object that contains a title property, which is of type string, and we'll initialize it as an empty array. And now we can use one of Ionic's lifecycle hooks here, IonViewWillEnter, and we can set this .notes to this .getAllNotes. So IonViewWillEnter is just a lifecycle event. This one runs when a page is about to enter and become the active page. There are a number of different lifecycle events that we can make use of, including IonViewDidLoad, IonViewDidEnter, among others, including when we're about to leave a page, for instance. If you'd like to see a full list of other lifecycle events, then be sure to check out the Ionic docs, and you can find these under lifecycle events under nav controller. Okay, and then back in our note service, I'm going to go ahead and just remove what's in our constructor here, because we don't actually need anything in our constructor here yet. Okay, so the last thing we need to do here is to actually create the part of our template that will allow us to display the notes that we're saving on the home page here. So I'm going to go to the home.html template page. And then here, just above our button, what I'm going to do is create a new Ion list. So you can see the number of different components that Ionic provides out of the box, which are really useful. And here we'll create a button. We'll use the Ion item directive here to provide some styling. And now we can use the standard ng4, star ng4 here, to loop through our array of notes. So we can just say let note of notes. And then we can use some interpolation here to just go ahead and grab the title from each of those notes, which is the only property that we have on it anyway at the moment. Okay, so this is just pretty standard Angular here. So this notes in our let note of notes is referring to the notes property that we have in our component. And when this view is about to enter, we call our getAllNotes method, which invokes our note service to return a copy of all the notes that it's storing. So let's go ahead and test it out. So we'll create a new note, call it first note, and then we'll go ahead and try to save it. Okay, so we don't get any sort of feedback, but if we click back, now we can see that we have the first note in our list. So we can go ahead and add a second note, and we can save that, and then we go back and we can see that second note is also in our list. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is inside of our source directory, I'm going to create a new subdirectory, and we'll just call that models. And we're going to use this directory to store a model for our note object. So let's go ahead and create a new file. It's going to be a new TypeScript file, and we're just going to call it note.model.ts. And it's just going to contain a simple interface export. So we'll go ahead and export interface note. And now we can define the different properties that any note in our app will have. So let's keep it simple. We'll have a title, which will be a string. We'll have some content, which will hold the note content, which will be a string. Then we'll have a date, so we'll allow the user to select a date. And then I'm going to have this property createDate, which will be a number. And we'll take a look at how we're going to use this a little bit later, but we're essentially going to use it to be a way to get a sort of unique identifier for any note that gets created. And it's going to be represented as a number because when we create a new date, we are going to essentially represent that in milliseconds since, I believe, January 1st, 1970. So we'll take a look at how that's used in a little while. Okay, so what I want to do now is to implement Ionic storage. So let's head back into our providers directory and then into our note service. So if you recall previously, we imported storage from Ionic storage, but we haven't implemented it yet. So previously we were simply pushing a new object onto this notes array anytime we were saving it. Using this method, we don't really get any data persistence. So as soon as we get a new instance of our note service, we get an empty array of our notes, and so that essentially has the effect of deleting any of the notes that we've stored there anytime our application restarts. So we're going to use Ionic storage to do some basic data persistence now. And we're lucky in that with Ionic storage, it's actually pretty easy to get data persistence set up. So let's take a look. The first thing that I'd like to do is to remove these objects that we've used as sort of placeholders for our note object, and now we can actually bring in the new note interface that we had defined. And so we'll go ahead and import that from our models directory. So now our notes property will just be a collection or an array of this note object, if you will. And likewise, when we save a note here, we can also make it of type note. Okay, so this shouldn't really change the functionality yet. We just have this new object type which has several different properties on it. So anytime we save a note, what I'm going to do is, first thing that I'm going to do is simply set that create date that we talked about just a moment ago as a new date.now, returning a number which, as I mentioned, will basically just be the number of milliseconds since January 1st, 1970 UTC. And so we should get a new number, at least for our purposes, anytime we create a new note here. If we wanted to scale our app and perhaps make this a little bit more robust, then we might find a different way to get a unique identifier here. But as I mentioned, this should serve our purposes. So we're still going to push a note onto our array. But now what we'll do is we'll say this.storage, and we need to actually bring in or inject a storage service, if you will, into our constructor of type storage. Again, this is coming from Ionic storage. And so this.storage has some methods on it, including a set method. And so as you can see from the little IntelliSense I got there, this is going to basically set a value for a given key. So we're going to have a sort of like dictionary type structure where we have key value pairs that we can set and access with storage. So we'll make a key notes, and we can set any other sort of object here. So let's just go ahead and set our notes array to that notes key. Okay, so now how are we going to get all notes? Well, let's look at how we can get notes from storage. So if, for instance, if our app were to refresh and we were to get this.notes, then we would just simply get an empty array if nothing had yet been pushed onto that array. So what we'll do instead here is we'll return, and then we'll use this.storage. And now we'll use a method get that we have here, and you can see that this is just to get the value associated with a given key. So we have a sort of getter and a setter method here, and now we just pass it that key, and this is going to return a promise. So we can call then on it to pass it a callback function to do something when this promise gets resolved. So let's just call that notes. And what we want to do here is, first of all, we want to handle the initial case when notes is null. So let's just do it this way. We're going to set this.notes equal to notes, which should get returned from our callback function. But when that's null, then we are going to set it to empty array, otherwise return us notes. So we have a sort of ternary operator here where we want to check whether or not notes that we're getting back from local storage is null. If that's the case, then return an empty array. Otherwise, return the notes that we should get back from local storage. And so we set that to this.notes that is on our class here, and then what we can do is once again simply return a copy of them here. So we use the spread operator inside of square brackets here to return a copy of this as an array. So as we saw previously, you could also just return this.notes.slice as well to return a copy. So that part, I'll just leave up to you. Okay, cool. So now you can see that that's actually super easy to simply get some data persistence set up using Ionic storage. And Ionic storage is going to be handling all of the, the storage aspect of keeping this data persisted in the background. And so it will be using things like local storage or SQLite or Web SQL, things like that, to provide us with that data persistence. Also, if you missed it in the previous video, you will want to double check your app.module TypeScript file in the app directory and ensure that you've imported Ionic storage module from Ionic storage and included it among your imports and called for root on it here. Okay, so while we're in here, what I'm going to do is go ahead and make another import for some forms. So we can import forms module as well as reactive forms module from Angular/forms. Okay, and we're going to use the forms module and the reactive forms module to improve the form that we have currently in use in our app. So we're going to come down here, and in our imports array we need to actually make sure that we bring those in. So forms module and reactive forms module. If you don't import these modules, then you'll get some kind of strange errors when we update our forms. Okay, so that should take care of our imports for the time being. Now I'd like to head back to our add note page. So you can F12 there if you're using Visual Studio Code, and if you haven't removed the scaffolded code here in the placeholder code, we can remove that as well. Okay, so what I want to do now is to head back to our add note page that we briefly built up in the previous video. And you'll notice now that we should also implement our note object rather than use this sort of in-place object that we were calling value before when we were saving a note. So I'm going to make this of type note, and we'll actually call the param that we pass it note. And so we'll need to make sure that we bring that in as well. So I'll control period here and bring it in from our models directory, and then we will just go ahead and update the param here as well. Okay, so far so good. The other thing I'm going to do is remove nav params from our constructor here. So if you have that in your constructor, we can go ahead and remove it, and really all that we need in this class anyway is a nav controller and a note service injected. So and all we have currently is the save note method, which will invoke save note from our injected instance of a note service here, and we are going to save some sort of note object. So we'll need a way to actually pass that note object from our form to our component here so that it can then be passed to our note service. So we'll take a look at what is in the templates. Let's head over there. And so you can see that previously we built this sort of template driven form where when we submit that form, we pass the form's value and whatever it contains here to our component. And you can see we have this text area with a name title, and that was all we were actually passing back with the ng model binding. So we had some property title with an ng model directive on it. And so we're going to update our form here from being a very simple sort of template-based form to a more model-based and reactive form. So let's take a look at that now. So first of all, we're going to use two new sort of directives here. We're going to use form group, which will be sort of an input, which will be an input, and we'll set that to form group. We're still going to bind to on an ng submit event here, and rather than call add note on the component and passing it the value on our form, in fact we can go ahead and remove the reference to the form itself, and we can pass this form group object's value up. So this form group is going to contain a number of different form controls. In fact, just one form control for each of the different fields that we'd like to pass from our form back up to the component. So let's take our title, for instance, here, and I'm going to change this ion text area to an ion input, which is what it should have been to begin with. So we've got an ion input for our title here now. And I'm going to remove this ng model directive. Our ion input will still have a name title. I'm also going to give it a type of text. But now we're going to use this form control name, and we're going to set that to title. This is going to allow us to bind to a title property in our component, but this title property will be a sort of child, if you will, of this form group as a whole. Okay, now we can do some sort of reactive stuff here, which is pretty cool. What we're going to do is make a div class alert, and we're going to ngIf and say if the form is not valid, or if this field is not valid, then we're going to cause this alert div to show. So we can say if the form group dot controls, and we can access title here, so you can see that our form control is title, and so form group has this controls collection on it that we can access using the form control name of title here. And then we can simply say .valid to check if this particular form control is valid. Something else kind of neat we can do here is we might say if it's not valid and it's been touched. So in other words, it's not going to be valid when the form first loads because it'll be empty and it's required. But if it's been touched and it's not valid, and I gotta pass the form control name here again. Oops, and we should put this in double quotes. So if it's been touched and it's not valid, then we'll show some alert, and we can just bind that to some property. So title alert. I'm gonna just put this on two separate lines so it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, so we've got this div, and we're going to show it using an ngIf. The title form control is not valid and the form control has been touched, and then we're just going to show title alert here, which we can define in our component. Okay, so I think that's pretty cool and relatively clean anyway. Now I'm going to go ahead and just copy the ion item and make a second one here for the note content. So we'll just say maybe note here, and the name will be content, as will the form control name. Okay, so if the content is not valid and it's been touched, then we can show some content alert. Okay, finally, we're going to copy one more ion item, and I'm going to put it above here as the first item in our form, and we're just going to use this to provide a little date selector. And so what we'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and actually just remove the alert and the input, and we can actually say ion date time and then supply a display format here. So we'll do month, day, and year. And then we can also give this a form control name, as we should, date, so that we can pass that up to our component. And this will be really nice. We'll see in just a moment that this will provide us with a clean date selector for our app. Okay, so one more thing we can do, since we have access to this form group object now, is on our button, we can make our button actually disabled if the form group as a whole is not valid. So we can say form group.valid. So our save note button will then become enabled when the form group as a whole is valid. Okay, so I think that looks good. Let's head back into the component now and take care of handling this new form. It's not going to be all that difficult really to get it wired up. First of all, we'll have a reference to our form group, which will be of type form group. And we'll just need to make sure that we bring form group in from Angular Forms. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and bring in validators and form control. Okay, then let's create a property to hold our submitted form. We'll call that note of type note, and that will be the same note that we'll have a date, which will be a new date for its default value, and then we'll have a title, which will be a string, which we can set to empty string, and content string. Again, we'll set that to empty string as well. So we've got our constructor, and what we're going to do inside the constructor when we have a new instance of this class is set this .form group equal to a new form group, and we can just simply define it as an object of these types here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have a new form group, and the properties on it will be title, which is a new form control, content, which is a new form control, and date. So we have our three fields that we looked at in the template. We have a title, content, and a date, and we have our save note method. So let's double check back in the template here. ng submit add note. Yeah, we want this to say save note. That's okay. You can call it post note or add note or save note, as I have here. Just want to make sure that that calls the correct method in the component. And then one more thing that we're going to add here is, if you recall from the previous video, when we saved a note, we didn't really get any feedback, and we had to click back in our application and go to the home page. We're simply going to use the nav controller now to pop the current view off of the stack. If you recall from either the first or second video, when we talked a little bit about how Ionic is, specifically the nav controller is managing our navigation through the app. It's managing it as a stack. So if we pop the current view off of that stack, we go to the previous view, which in this case should be the home page. So when we save a note, we will invoke our note service to save it to storage, and then we'll pop the current view off, which should take us back to the home page. Okay, so speaking of the home page, we should head back there and take a look at the component. And as you can see, we need to go ahead and use that new note interface that we built, sort of model for our note, and go ahead and reference that import here. So we can import that from models, note.model. Okay, and you can see that it's going to be upset now, because if you recall, when we used getAllNotes, this is going to return a promise of a note array, because we're using Ionic storage now. So there's a couple different things we could do here. What I'm going to do is actually make notes a promise of note array type, and that's going to satisfy this method, but now we're getting a promise of notes back and not an array of notes. And so we need a way to handle that. We could call .then on getAllNotes, within which we could create a callback function and then set notes equal to the return. But what I'd like to do instead is head over into our template, and when we are using this for loop where we say let note of notes, what I'd like to do is to use the async pipe here. So we can pipe async, And what this is going to do is simply return the result of that promise as it's available directly in the template here. So you can use the async pipe with observables or promises, and it's really nice in the case of observables because it will actually handle unsubscribing from that observable to prevent memory leaks, which is something that you would consider doing otherwise in the component. So it's nice to be able to do this in the template. Okay, so that looks good. When we click our Add Note button, we'll get taken to our Add Note page. And sorry about this, but I see some typos here as well. So obviously we don't need to end our double quotes here. So just be sure in your your start ngIf directives here that they start with double quotes and end with double quotes, and they wrap the Boolean expression. So I think that looks okay. And now let's go ahead and fire up the server and take a look. So if it's not running already, we can just Ionic serve. And if you have been running the server, then you may want to consider restarting because we've updated our app.module file. Okay, so you can see we have our application here. We can click Add Note, and we have our 3 fields. So we can go ahead and set a date with the date picker. That's kind of nice. And we can supply some title, so let's say grocery list, and we can go ahead and save this note. So we can see it here. We'll go ahead and add a new note, and we'll go ahead and save that. And so we can see our second note here. And in fact, if we refresh the application now, we can see that these notes are persisting, and that is thanks to Ionic storage. So if you need to clear out your local storage and you're using Chrome, then in the inspector, you can head over to the application tab, at least at the time of this recording. I believe this used to be under a separate tab, but I don't remember the name if you're using a previous version of Chrome. But in any case, you can see the various local storage that Chrome has here. We've got Web SQL, and under that you can see actually _Ionic storage here. So you can see all of our note data here under the notes key, again with the value just being an array of these objects which happen to map directly to the note interface that we created in our app. So if you want to clear any of this out, what you can do is simply click this clear storage. You can actually see how much is being used, and just be sure that everything under storage is selected, and then clear all site data. And that's simply going to remove local storage for this particular domain. In my case is localhost at port 8100. So if we refresh now, then we will lose our data, but that was simply because we cleared our storage from local storage. You also may get some weird things going on if you don't clear local storage and you make certain changes to your app. You may see some unexpected behavior. Keep in mind that you just have this simple key value pair that's set up under Web SQL in the Ionic storage sort of database here, which is currently empty because we just emptied it. But yeah, you're going to want to prevent some collisions there if you have the same key and then all of a sudden you have brand new data. So I just like to go ahead and clear out all of this local storage anytime I make sort of major development changes to the app. Okay, so we're almost wrapped up with our Ionic app. Now what I'd like to do is just to make some aesthetic changes, as well as the ability to select a note and then get taken to a note detail page, if you will. So let's go ahead and get the functionality of the note detail page worked out first, and then we'll worry about making the app look a little bit nicer. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the server. If it's still running for you, just go ahead and stop it. And what we're going to do is Ionic generate page view-note. So you can see the OK response here, and then it generated this new page for us. Let's go ahead and take a look. We can see it under our pages. We have this view note directory, which contains our template and our component as well as our SCSS file. Let's go ahead and hammer out the template since it should be pretty straightforward. Go ahead and, as usual, remove the boilerplate code. And in our Ion content, I'm going to use an Ion card element here. And the Ion card will have Ion card content. This is just a nice component that Ionic provides for us to display some data. And here we'll have Ion card title. This is going to give us a sort of material design type card component to work with. And here we're going to have access to a note object in this view. So let's go ahead and grab the title property off of that note object. And then maybe just below it we'll have a div with class note date. And we will grab the date. Just using interpolation here again. All right, then I'm just going to keep things kind of simple. We're going to have a separator there, and then we'll have a div that just contains the note content. Okay, that's all good. And then maybe at the bottom of our view here, we can have an ion footer. This is going to put a sort of div, if you will, at the very bottom of our view. And in here we'll have a button, ion button. And with Ionic we can specify a color. And danger will make it a sort of red color. We'll make it block, which will make the button spread across the entire bottom of our view. And we'll have a click event here to actually delete a note. So we want the ability to delete notes as well as to create them. And what we're going to do is pass our unique identifier in the form of create date here to a click event. So we'll just go ahead and bind that delete note method to a click event on this button. And then we can say delete note. Okay, so that's going to take care of a very simple note detail page, if you will, that we'll call view note. And so let's head into the component to kind of wire things up. Again, I'm going to remove the boilerplate, and we're going to inject a note service instance into our constructor of type note service. We'll go ahead and bring that in. And we're going to create a new method on the note service to handle that delete. But first, we're going to need to get a note. So let's go ahead and create a property note. And oops, and we need to bring in our note model as well. And we're going to say this.note is equal to this.navparams.getNote. And the way this is going to work, we'll see here in just a moment. We're actually going to pass a note to this view, and the way that we access that object is by calling navparams.get. And it's going to be a note object, so we are going to set the note object in this class to that object that we retrieve using note params. Okay, I'm not going to worry about this lifecycle hook, but we will have a delete note method, which will take this create date, and then we're going to pass it as we saw in our template, which is a number type. Because if you recall from the last video, when we create any new note, I just new up a new date, and that will be essentially the number of milliseconds since January 1st, 1970 UTC, so represented as a number. And so we'll invoke our note service here, and we'll write a new method on it called delete note, and we will find that once again using this create date as our unique identifier. After that's done, we can just simply use the nav control, as we've seen previously, to pop this view from the stack, because the nav controller is managing our routing as a stack. So we'll pop this view note page from the top of the stack, which should reveal the next view in the stack, which will be our home page. Okay, so let's head over into our note service and implement this delete note functionality. So we're going to head there with F12, and then under get all notes, we're going to create that delete note method, and it's going to take our create date, which is a number. And so let's think about this for a minute, because it's not immediately obvious how we're going to delete a single note, given the fact that when we're using storage here, we're basically updating a single key that contains an array of notes as its values. So the key in our local storage is notes, and we've got this note array as its value. So the way that we're going to delete a specific note, given its unique identifier, is not, of course, to delete the notes array, but rather to return that notes array as it is, except for the note that we want to delete. So let's do that. So we know we're going to set this.notes, and we're going to say this.notes is equal to itself, but then we're going to use filter, and we'll pass it a callback that will basically say return where the create date on a given note is not equal to the create date that we pass our method. And then once that's called, then we can once again set that in storage. So if we were to have many other methods here, then we might refactor, since we're using this line repeatedly here, where we're just setting this notes key to this .notes, but it's fine here as well. But again, notice what we're doing is we're not, in a sense, deleting, if you will, but rather we're using filter to return that notes array with all of its elements except for the one that contains the create date for the note that we want to remove. So I think this is kind of a nice example of using filter when we're working with an array of objects that we want to mutate in some way. Okay, so that's all good, but now how are we actually going to get to our view note page? Well, we're going to want to get a note from the home page so that we can display its data, all of its data, on this view note page. So I'm going to add one more method to our note service here, and we'll call that getNote. And we're going to pass it a create date, which would be a number. Again, recall that this is our unique identifier for a given note. So here we're going to use this .storage again, and we're going to get. Obviously we need to get a note from our collection of notes, so we'll start with getting that collection using the key. And this is going to return a promise. So we'll write then, and then we'll write a callback function here so that when it resolves, we can do something with that promise. So what we're looking for is a single note. So what I'm going to do is create a private note property, which is of type note. And so we're getting that collection of notes from storage as a promise. And so when it resolves, we're going to set this .note equal to all of those notes we're getting back, or rather a copy of them that we can get using the spread operator again. And now we can use .find to find a note by its create date. So create date is equal to the create date that we pass this method. And then we'll return this .note. So similar to how we used filter previously to return a collection of notes, save for the note that we're deleting that we looked up, if you will, by its create date, when we use find, we can explicitly return a single instance of a note from an array by looking for a create date that matches on any one of those notes, and then simply returning it. So now we have a way for our service to return a note given its unique identifier to any other component that is requesting it. And where might we want to request it? Well, we want to request it on our home page where we have a list of notes. So we want to be able to click on a note, and when we click on it, we want to get taken to our view note page. And if you recall, our view note page that we were just working with has a way to receive a note object from some nav params. So let's wire this up now. So on our home page template, what I want to do is just add a simple click event binding. So click to some method called getNote. And of course we have the note, so we can just grab its create date. Okay, cool. So let's write this method in our component. So under add note, maybe we'll write a getNote method. It takes a create date, which is of type number. And we'll invoke our note service and specifically use the new getNote method that we just wrote. Pass it the create date that we're passing in from the template. And recall, this is going to return us a promise. So then what we'll do is we'll simply say, when that resolves, we set this .note, because our promise will return that note object that it's finding from our array. And so we can go ahead and create a note property here. And I'm just going to explicitly make these private. Okay, so now when this promise resolves, we set our note. And now that we have the note, we can actually use our nav controller again to do something pretty cool, which is to actually push the view note page. So we'll bring that in. So that, of course, will bring up the view note page, but the view note page's constructor is expecting us, or has the ability to receive some object. So as a second parameter to push here, we can add any nav params that we want to pass along to the view. So we're going to pass this object, we're going to call it note, and we're going to set it equal to this dot note. So what's neat about this is we're just passing some object to the view. We've got a note property on it. We set it equal to this note that we've retrieved from our service. And then back in our view note component, in the constructor, we can see that we are going to immediately set this dot note on this page to some nav params that we're passing this view, specifically the note from that object that we're passing. So this is kind of a neat way, I think, to pass data between pages in Ionic, simply using nav params and the nav controller. So if we've wired this up correctly, we should be able to now see it if we start the server back up. Okay, so let's take a look. We'll go ahead and add a note. And now if we click it, we see that no component factory found for view note page. Did you add it to ngModule.entry components? And no, we did not. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I forget to do this often as I've been working with Ionic, because it's not something that we typically do if we're using just a plain Angular project using the Angular CLI. But take a look in app.module.ts and note that we have some entry components in an array here. And we need to add any pages that Ionic is going to need to render into these entry components, which will include all the pages for our application. So let's go ahead and include that here. So view note page, go ahead and make sure it's imported. Likewise, we'll add it to our declarations. So at least at the time of this recording, the Ionic CLI is not adding view note, or it's not adding new pages that we generate to our declarations or entry components array. Okay, so let's see if that has solved our issue. I'm going to go ahead and stop the server and restart. Okay, notice that when you restart, you should still see what's in your local storage, unless there's something kind of wonky going on with your local storage. In any case, now when we click on our note, we get taken to this page. And so that's pretty cool. We also have our delete note button. So if we delete it, let's see if this is working. It appears to be working because our note no longer exists. So let's add a couple of test notes here. And we should be able to click on a note. And yeah, we can see it. That's pretty cool. We can click on another note and we can see some different data. So let's see what happens when we delete a note. And we can see that the new note that we had just created disappears. Okay, so now what I want to do with the basic functionality of our app more or less complete is let's go ahead and just apply some very basic styling to the app and just kind of clean it up a little bit before we deploy it using Ionic View. So I'm going to just minimize this, and for now we can even just stop the server. And what I'm going to do is close out a bunch of these windows. And what I'm going to do now is take a look in our assets directory. So we have in our assets directory this images folder, which currently just contains an Ionic logo in there. So what I'm going to do is drop some background images here into this directory. And this website just provides a bunch of free stock photos that are really high quality. So they're kind of nice for use in building sort of test applications or demo applications. I'm not affiliated with these guys in any way. I just figured I would give you a heads up that this is what I use a lot of times, and yeah, I find it to be really easy to find some good photos here. Let's find some background images. All right, that one looks good, and I'm just gonna download like a medium size. This one looks good, we'll download this one. And then, I don't know, maybe something like this looks good. Okay, so we've got some images. I'm just gonna drop them here into the images directory. And I'll just rename them to like BG1, BG2, and BG3. All right, so those look good. Now what we can do is in any one of our style sheets, so let's take a look. So like in home, we'll go into our home.scss file, and I'm just gonna paste in some styles here. So you can see that we can sort of nest our selectors here, which is kind of nice. So we can see that in this Ion content div that we'll have in our homepage component, we'll just have a background and need to fix that. So it's going to be in assets/images, and then we'll have this bg1.jpg. So you can provide a relative path in your URL, and so that should work. Likewise, on our add note page, if we go into the SCSS file there, I'm just going to go ahead and paste. We'll grab our second background image, and then finally in view note, I'm going to go ahead and paste, and you can see that here we'll use our bg3.jpg. So again, just use whatever images that you've collected and named in your assets/images directory. This other stuff here is basically just applying a little bit of a gradient overlay to each of the images. This is an effect that you may have seen before, where we have a sort of semi-transparent or semi-opaque background gradient, and that's going to get overlaid on this background image. I also have some CSS class selectors here, just to do a little bit of styling to some of the other elements on this page. Okay, so let's go take a look. I'm going to go ahead and start the server. Okay, and we'll inspect to get more of a device type view. And so you can see there's our background. It's pretty cool. If we add a note, we can see another page with another background. And if we view a note, again, we have a third background with a little bit more styling on our page here. So this is pretty nifty. We might add some more things to sort of like maybe add the date to our collection of notes here. And you could do that very easily. For instance, if we just head back to the home page, it's really up to you, but maybe you have some span here that contains the note.date, for instance. And so you can see it here, and then you could sort of style it however you like. Maybe we move it back here, and I think the name of our class was just date. So there's just a little bit more styling you can do, and you can just play around with this and get it to a place where you're happy with it. Okay, so now we've sort of completed a demo version of our application. There's certainly other things you could do here. Maybe you have the ability to edit a note or copy a note, or maybe even like text a note or something like that. There's lots of things that we could do from here, but we have a basic CRUD application set up, or at least create, read, and destroy. So like I said, you may want to create a method to edit a note on a page. That shouldn't be too difficult. We've looked at ways to access a note directly using the unique identifier that we've chosen here. And so you may want to consider adding a method to your note service to say update a note, and you could again get that note just by using this create date that we're using as the identifier. So I'll leave that up to you to make improvements to the app, make updates, or add new features. For now, let's go ahead and see how we can actually deploy this app to a device using Ionic View. So at the time of this recording, if you head over to ionicframework.com/pros/view, you can get some information here about View. Basically a way to, as you can see here, share, test, and collect feedback on your apps. And this basically allows you to do that without ever going through the app stores. So I'm not sure exactly how it's working, but basically you would download View onto your device, and it serves as almost like a container for your application. So I have an iPhone, and I simply downloaded the new View app, or the newer View app. Note that there is a legacy Ionic View, which I believe has a white icon, but the most up-to-date View app, again at the time of this recording, has an icon with a blue background. So if you're following along here, go ahead and get the current View app if you're using an iPhone or Android here. And then go ahead and sign up. And note that this is all free, at least just for creating a small app here to test out on your own device. So I'm going to go ahead and log into my account here. And you can see that I've previously deployed an app. So just to start fresh here, I'm going to go ahead and delete this app, and we'll go ahead and create a new one. We'll give it a name. We're just going to call it My Notes again. You can call yours whatever you like. We'll go ahead and create it. And then it's just going to give you some very straightforward instructions to build and deploy your application. So what we want to do is connect an existing app, and this is going to be very similar to using other sort of platforms as a service. So if you're using, like, say, Heroku or something to deploy an application, then this is going to look very similar. Basically, you're going to push a Git repo containing your Ionic code to Ionic, and it's going to take care of building your application and deploying it. Then on your device, you can log into your account and access that application and then launch it directly from Ionic View. So let's go ahead and just do that. Let me go ahead and stop the server. And so we're in our project directory. We want to make sure that we have the latest Ionic CLI. Okay, so at the time of my recording, I've got Ionic 3.19.0, and then we'll go ahead and Ionic link, and then you pass your Pro ID to link the current app to your Ionic account, and then we can go ahead and git push Ionic master here. Okay, and I forgot my password a few times, but luckily on the third time we got it. Okay, and once that's done, we should be able to refresh the page here. And you can see the branch that you have here along with the latest commit. So if we click here, we can actually see the build log, which is pretty cool. You can even package a build for iOS or Android, which will require you to upgrade to a Pro account. And you can do some versioning here for iOS or Android. So that's pretty cool. If we head back to our account here, you can see now that we have an app associated with our account called My Notes. And so if you have the Ionic View app on your device, you can go ahead and log into your account and then deploy this application for testing to your device.